Fabulous. Welcome, everybody. We're just letting people in, so just take a couple minutes for everybody to get in, and then we'll get started. But just get some housekeeping up front. If you've not used Zoom before, you can change the view at the top right to speaker view or gallery view, depending on how you want to engage with us. And then at the bottom, there's a chat feature. And if you want to ask any questions of us as we're going through the session, feel free to jump in. We've got a whole bunch of questions people sent in advance, but always happy to field questions as we go through our session today. Again, welcome. I'm Brad McCabe with Sponsor Circle. Happy to have with me today David Dimitrovic from Vertical Scope and Brian Wiley from Connect Interactive, talking about cookies, what that means, the changes for tracking within websites, as well as the changes going on with Apple and a number of other privacy elements that are changing the advertising world, and chatting about what the implications are for sponsorship. So happy to start that conversation shortly. And just before we get into that, I want to let you know on June 16th, we've got Adam Mitchell joining us from Sponsor Pulse, talking about sponsorship valuation, sentiment tracking. They've got a great tool IMI has developed with Sponsor Pulse, and happy to share that and have Adam walk us through the tool and how that can benefit you. So I think what I'll do is I'll let David and Brian introduce themselves and where they fit within the advertising world. David, do you want to jump in and tell us a bit about Vertical Scope?
Sure, yeah. So got a bit of an echo there. So yeah, I work for Vertical Scope. I'm a director of marketing strategy and analytics there, and what my job is to do is to look at our platform and really help our advertisers get the best use out of our platform. What's interesting about Vertical Scope is that you may have not have heard of us, but we own and operate well over 1,000 websites across automotive, pet, power sports, health, technology. And so we're quite diversified as far as being a publisher is concerned. And we actually own a number of assets. You might be familiar with some of the bigger brands that we own and operate. Certainly in Canada, we own and operate redflagdeals.com. And we also own an asset that actually is entrenched in the sponsorship world, a website called bimmerfest.com, which actually was an asset that we acquired a few years ago and has a rather large community following online for it. So there you go.
Perfect. So yeah, so you're on the publisher side, and then Brian, where does Connected Interactive fit in?
That is a great question. Where do we fit in? We're on the sell side of the spectrum. So I'm the chief operating officer at Connected Interactive, and we sell programmatic campaigns as well as mobile campaigns and social campaigns. And our focus, our unique selling proposition, is that we work really closely with some unique Canadian data partnerships. So this is a topic that's been around for us. Actually, we've been thinking about the cookieless future for probably about 4 years now. So it's something that we've been working pretty hard to get ourselves prepared for. But as the time gets closer, we're certainly seeing everybody sort of rushing to make their changes and adjust as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I know the cookie element. Everybody clicks on those cookie accept buttons so quickly just to get to the content. But what exactly is the cookie managing and allowing you to do through the website and the tracking elements that it provides?
Well, from our perspective, the value of the cookie is in campaign metrics or KPIs, being able to measure the success of a campaign, doing things like retargeting people after they've come to a site, or tracking the purchase funnel. And all of the stages that that a consumer will go through that purchase funnel and ultimately through to some sort of an acquisition at the end. So the cookie is in place to help us measure all of those things and track all of those things and be able to do proper attribution back in the media channel to understand, say, for example, where that purchase has come from, and optimize. So that's the value of the cookie from our perspective. And then when we need to look to augment impressions that we're driving, in the past, and a lot of programmatic suppliers will apply third-party data. So that's data provided by some sort of an external supplier that becomes either aggregated or anonymized in some sort of fashion, attributed to behaviors or tactics that consumers utilize when they're surfing around on the web. And then those data points can also be augmented pre-bid in order to try and find a better user or somebody who's more likely to do the purchase or whatever the KPI happens to be.
And what's the the biggest impacts of Google's removal of cookies and the change in iOS where it's limiting the tracking through apps?
The removal of the cookie means a couple of things. All that augmented data that is used to apply on campaigns disappears, as well as everything from a retargeting tracking or pixelation or conversion tracking, all of that funnel tactic activity, that all goes away as well. So it becomes a matter of being a little bit more broader based, more speculative approach, prospecting, those types of activities have to become more prominent, as well as looking at, specific verticals. Dave, I'm just setting you up there. Looking at specific verticals
Thank you.
Within which you might want to advertise based on what that content is. So content is going to have to be a major replacement for that. And iOS 14, that's another whole other bucket of worms, can of worms. Depending on, it's probably more of a bucket. I think it's becoming bucket size, where you're getting into just the consumer. The consumer aspect, the consumer behavior of removing that tracking capability from in-apps, was something that was really reliant for, especially in the attribution channel. We have lots of clients who do app install campaigns and they pay per install, and being able to attribute where that installs come from was a really important part of that proposition, and that becomes just more difficult based on the iOS changes. And I think they're seeing already some changes that are pretty dramatic. I saw a report that anywhere between only 5 to 10% of people are opting in throughout the US with the latest change that Apple's introduced. So that's pretty big. There's going to be some apps that require it. People in certain cases aren't going to want to get away from it because there's a convenience factor. I think, Dave, you can talk a little bit about that from a web perspective for sure.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I'm just going back a couple questions, right? Initially, we were just talking about sort of the use case for cookies and what happens in the absence that they go away. I think it's important, and I know we'll probably touch on this, is the distinction between first and third party cookies. And we think going back to why cookies exist, right? Cookies are there to help me remember that you belong to this website and that you have preferences that are set up here. A very benign, mostly benign sort of convenient sort of thing. When you start talking about how this plays in the advertising ecosystem, it's quite interesting because now what we're really fundamentally talking about is the third-party cookies. Now, first-party cookies will still continue to exist. It's really the third-party cookies and the way that we've been operating and using them has been in decline and is what Google is essentially saying they're not going to be supporting anymore. And it's important to make that distinction, I think, in that what we're talking about is the distinction between first-party data and versus third-party cookies. Now, that being all said, third-party doesn't necessarily mean bad, right? So if you think about the advertising, how advertising has worked for millennia, is the fact that you rely on some of these third-party sources to measure things that you do, right? So this is why we have third-party bodies to measure things that you can't measure internally, right? What changed was that there was now had this ability now to actually activate against those third-party sources where you couldn't before. And so like the use case I'm thinking of is, say an advertiser approaches Vertical Scope and they want to target somebody of a particular income. This is something that we don't inherently ask people when they join. So we don't join our website. So we don't actually have that information on hand. And so this is where it's useful for us to be able to leverage a third-party source that actually helps us triangulate or overlap our audience with another data set that allows us to augment our data set and give us the ability to actually target against age in it, or age, or sorry, in income rather, right? So this is what's happening now. And so what advertisers are, sorry, publishers are trying to do now is obviously through identity management systems and that kind of thing, is augment what they have already and build out upon the first party data sets that they've already built.
I guess one good thing though that's happening, sorry Brad, from an execution perspective on the sell side, is that it's not going to all happen at once. Safari already introduced some changes, right? So there's already some impact going on from being able to do retargeting and conversion tracking. We're already seeing reduced impressions using those types of tactics, as well as Google through their demand side platform DV360. They've already depreciated some of those affinity-based targeting aspects, a number of other data sets that were free in the platform. So a buyer could go in and just, if somebody was interested in eyeglasses, we might be able to find that affinity-based data right in Google's platform. And that's all gone. So it's we're being weaned into the situation, so which is actually kind of a good thing. There's also, you could also take a look at GDPR, what happened in the UK. You could take a look at California to a degree, who've changed some major privacy legislation. The really good thing for us as Canadians is that we're also being prepared for a mindset that we're going to have to accept when the Canadian digital privacy comes into effect in 2022, which will have some additional layers of changes that are going to impact targeting and how we think about consumers and individual privacy.
Yeah, and if I understand, first party and third party correctly, I mean, you've got the traffic on your website or your app or the different elements where you're capturing your customer, your user, your audience data. Is that limited in terms of the information that you've captured through there? I mean, is the first party cookie different than a third party cookie? So think about the third party data really possibly offers all that expanded information about those identity groups. So has that become much more challenging now?
Dave, you can throw down on that one as the first party data holder.
So sure. So can you repeat that?
We're just thinking about the first party data. Is it a challenge because are you capturing everything you need in terms of those cookies? Like, is it what the data you get on your audience? Are there limitations to that were being amplified and augmented through the use of third party data? Demographics and
the use case, that was the primary use case, and I was trying to illustrate that earlier when I was talking about adding income to a profile makes things infinitely more attractive to an advertiser, right? And in some cases, you have advertisers who are mandating specific things, right? They want to find people who are in market, people who have these affinities or these interests, and so having that ability to sort of to provide that advertiser with that option where you might not have it. Say, for example, I fundamentally don't have any, I don't have an affinity for, we'll just say, dogs, right? And I can go on and buy that audience off the shelf, layer that against my own, and now I have the ability to offer that to advertisers. So that was the primary use case for this stuff. But as time has worn on, smart publishers have gotten better at cultivating, creating more content that addresses the needs of their advertisers. So a good example of that, think about a category like insurance, for example. The way to build out a data strategy or to collect data related to insurance or to identify people who are in market for an insurance product is to just produce a lot of content and drive a lot of activity to that content and garner that traffic and that activity, and that's how you're able to cultivate a data set that supports insurance specifically, which is not something and if you think about it on the web, right, you think about how many insurance sites and particularly in Canada, are dedicated to insurance. You may think of maybe there's probably one or two you can think off the top of your head, but it's not as heavily developed. So how do you address a gap in your data set? And that's one way of doing that, is just simply to create the content to support it.
Yeah, so then it really becomes one of those elements where it's got to be content driven, or you've got to start finding partners who have that content that you can work with to now gain all of that information.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Because I mean, is that how brands are adapting? Are they starting to find new ways to drive their own content, or are they working with partners? Are there workarounds that are happening to provide that data now?
Well, you know, if I look at our organization and as a publisher, you know, we operate in a lot of different spaces. You know, I talked about there's a huge community element to what we do, but we also own and operate really, you know, category dominant brands like motorcycle.com, for example, or autoguide.com. These are, you know, well-known online entities in their respective categories. So in our business, we not only do we have a very steeply based in community and people who join our websites because they they bought a new Honda CR-V and they decided now that they're going to be a member of that community, but they're also looking at you know, autoguide.com when they're in market to buy, say, a new vehicle, for example. And so so in addition to that that situation, we also produce content. We also we do professionally generated content, and in it that augments that user generated content that we provide. So as a publisher, we have a highly established, they're called geared content studio, and we actually produce professionally driven content on our own.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, you know, the likes of, you know, AutoGuide. Does the value of partnering with something like the International Auto Show become more important now because you kind of get access to that? I guess we'll call it second party data, where they can start sharing audiences to make sure you're augmenting your content and driving more first party data to your list.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you talk about the International Auto Show. In the United States, we participate, historically we've participated working with SEMA, which is supports the aftermarket community. And we would travel down there every year and we'd put up a booth and the whole thing. And so, you know, this year was interesting because they had to cancel the show. And so, and we do create a lot of content around it. We provide our own advertising opportunities in around that. But this year it didn't happen. So I know the SEMA has worked hard to create their own virtual version and their own digital asset, and hopefully with the fog lifting around COVID that they'll be able to do that this year. But you know, so we actively partner with them in the power sports community. It's so numerous that you can kind of touch on all these things. We partner in the United States with the MIC, which is the Motorcycle Industry Council, south of the border. So it's we have numerous relationships like these. And are they, in terms of data sharing, it's not overt data sharing in those scenarios. It's more classic partnership.
Yeah,
So
I think Brad, in general, brands and marketers want to be creating as much first-party data as possible, and brands are different things. The Vertical Scope is a brand, but it's set up of a bunch of websites. A brand could be a packaged goods company. A brand could be a retailer. A brand could be an entity like an event, for example. They all need to be thinking about ways that they can engage and create new channels for those who are interested in that brand or product to engage more often. Retailers are in a really good spot right now, especially some of the big ones that have loyalty programs that now have all kinds of people that have changed shopping behaviors and are online. And all those associated shopping behaviors are just building on all of that first party data that companies like Loblaws and Walmart owns. So, you know, they're doing some extremely interesting things with those. So every marketer or brand has to be thinking about, what do I own? What are my consumers interested in? How do I want to grow what I have? And how do I continue to capture and engage those people?
Yeah, and I'm thinking from, you know, putting the sponsorship hat on, does that make the audiences that different organizations have more valuable to brands when they're reaching out now, because they can actually start finding, okay, here's an event that has an audience similar to the type of consumer audience that I want. Is that going to increase the value versus, you know, the traditional, I guess, well, let's say programmatic investments that they may have done? And should people be thinking about ways to enable those incoming partners to find data activations in order for them to be able to capture that?
There should be more value in it. You know, I think each one of those venues or events should be taking a look at, you know, what the new reality of their competitive set looks like, and thinking about that from a value proposition. So if they've got a large scale audience, they've had them in the past, they can continue to re-engage them. It's a niche where you know, there's very few or no other operators. Then there's going to be more value in that. Dave, I'm going to steal your words. The smaller something is, the more valuable it is, right? So the less of something, the more demand there could be for something like that. So you know, in theory, you know, a really nice niche from a just sort of like, there's only one of its kind out there, but it has a lot of people that are engaging with it. I think that could have a lot of value for whoever is operating that. Yeah.
And then how much more defined should, or I guess maybe not more defined, I think one of the challenges a lot of organizations that I come across have is they want to appeal to everyone. So they kind of say to sponsors, oh, you know, we bring, you know, everyone 18 to 75 to our events, male and female. And I think that becomes a big challenge when you're trying to bring these niche opportunities. You know, how defined should people be thinking about when it comes to laying out their audience?
Well, having evaluated that kind of activity in the past, if I have a brand looking to do sponsorships and I have a broad-based brand that has mass appeal, then those might be the things I'm looking for. But you know, more niche opportunities where niche brands couldn't participate in those kinds of things in the past because it didn't make sense for them. I think that there's going to be more of an interest from those types of brands to be thinking about where they should be plopping their dollars. And I think those in the past that had such broad appeal need to be thinking about, how do I break this up into pieces? Sure, 18 plus were here, but were the 18 to 24-year-olds more involved in this section? And how do I break that out and understand it better so I can put more value in that section versus the 25 to 34s versus the 55 plus? Start thinking about how each one of those can get broken up. You can still always bring on a broad-based appeal brand to cover it all off, but individual pieces may have more value so that the pie gets more expensive.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say, just to chime in, I think about, you know, got me thinking about Bimmerfest, and I talked about that at the top of the discussion. And you know, if this is for BMW owners and enthusiasts, right? And so what you're doing, it's the interest that's actually driving, and the fanaticism around BMWs that drives the interest there. And so if you think about, you know, take demographics out of the equation, you're now talking about people all collected around one singular sort of premise, which is fandom around BMWs, which is pretty cool. You know, one thing we did a couple of years ago at Bimmerfest was we had, and I think it's in terms of appealing to advertisers, I think inherently you think, okay, well, shouldn't BMW obviously be an advertiser? Well, okay, we're a sponsor of this event, absolutely. But one year we did we sold into Alfa Romeo a test drive on the track there at Bimmerfest. And so, you know, I think it's more, I agree wholeheartedly with the way that Brian is talking about this, but I think you also have to think about you know, taking an interest-based approach too, and who can that appeal to? And in some cases, you can use that as an effort to speak to your own, or you can use that as a way to conquest against other brands.
Yeah. The other things to think about too are, you know, in terms of an event or a location, is if they know where my people are coming from, where they've come from in the past, where am I pulling from? Because there are other inherent data sets that could be out there that maybe just haven't factored in yet. Like, for example, geography. It's an area that we play in a lot, where geography becomes an indicator of where we want to advertise, because we know a lot about geographical locations. We know about what this postal code looks like versus that postal code. And an interesting way to tie all that together, the other thing that we do is we work with mobile devices. You know, iOS 14 aside, there's still a significant amount of scale in you know, grouping together mobile devices from locations and understanding a correlation between these devices, where they travel to and from. And they become a marketable channel as well, because you can actually market to groups of devices and message them at the same time. And they're not going to be impacted by the cookie. That's what I was saying at the beginning, that what I was talking about from a connected interactive perspective. We've been thinking about being cookie free for quite some time because we've been connecting devices to postal codes for about 4 years now. So as far as we're concerned, like, bring on the cookieless world, because we're already there.
Yeah, and I would echo that. Yeah, there's your commercial. I'm going to say, from a vertical, from on the publisher side, we are, owning and operating 1,000 sites that are highly verticalized. We're moving to a world that's going to be where context is increasingly more important, and of course, first-party data increasingly more important. And so these are two areas where we oops, sorry. Sorry about that. That was a little bit of something in the background. All right, so what I was saying, yeah, so of course, on cue. So being highly verticalized and operating in these verticals and having context, we're moving to a world that is going to be much where context is becoming increasingly more important. And we are kind of returning back to a time where your advertisement is content is adjacent the environment that it's supposed to be in, right? Add to that, the fact and the role that first-party data is going to play in that equation is really important. So we're really well primed for this new future. Where the risk is if for those people that are reliant on third-party cookies and reliant on programmatic channels more specifically, because even in Google's own analysis, they recognize that there is going to be some potential loss in revenue within those channels, because for the simple fact that as an advertiser, and Brian, you can speak to this, my ability to remarket or use these conventional targeting methodologies, I simply won't be able to identify my own data set in another environment. So henceforth, I'm going to bid less on that. And so that's where the issue is from a largely from a programmatic standpoint, right? But like I mentioned before, as an organization, we're preparing for this. We're thinking more about accentuating the assets that we already have, which are very, like I mentioned earlier, very contextually relevant in a lot of scenarios.
Yeah, and think about from organizations and what they're offering brands coming in as sponsors. Are there activations that are going to be more successful in delivering the data that the brands are looking for? Is this a digital play, or is there opportunity that if they've got a physical presence at an event that they're still able to deliver that data?
Well, I think I keep going back to BIMmerFest, but also thinking about even like what SEMA had to do this year, and they had to they started to scramble and think about, well, how do I deliver a virtual asset? If I think about BIMmerFest in contrast, it was a physical event that already had a really well developed digital community around it. Right, so where SEMA struggled to create a community, we had a pre-existing community against our asset, and I think the challenge or the opportunity for sponsors in particular is to say, lay out all your assets on the table and start thinking about how I can create, how I can augment those, or how I can scale those up. What am I doing with my digital assets? What am I doing with the website experience? How can I create more community around that? How do I create more community that exists all year round, as opposed to a singular event in time? Now, this past year, we had to cancel BIMmerFest, but the truth is, BIMmerFest represents a huge community online, and from a revenue standpoint, I don't know what the numbers are exactly, but it continues to collect revenue throughout the entire year, as opposed to just that singular event.
Well, I think that brings up a really good point, and it's a discussion that I've kind of been promoting in the sponsored world for a while. Is you've got your fans and your attendees who come to your event, and I remember hearing the head of partnerships for FC Barcelona talking about the fact that they've got so many millions of fans around the world, and 98% of them will never set foot on the grounds where they play, but 90% of their sponsorships delivered within that. So your fans haven't gone anywhere, and for BIMmerFest, those people haven't stopped owning a BMW,
right.
So they're still available for communication if you're delivering content. It's one of those things. I think it's just finding the right content and being able to bring partners in for that conversation.
Yeah, and I think you need to think about all your extensions associated to the assets that you have. You know, your social media assets, every asset you inherently has some value and creates a touch point for your sponsors to be a part of that conversation. And I think the gentleman you mentioned before that is going to be on in a couple of weeks, you know, that's being able to evaluate and properly frame the assets that you have is really very essential, I think.
Yeah, I think as well. Hey, Dave, didn't you say everybody who attended here was actually going to win a prize of driving a Beamer around a track?
That's precisely what I said. No, it's that's precisely what I said. No, you know, it just came. It was top of mind. We were just, you know, I was thinking about all the assets that we do own, and you know, here is one that's squarely at the center of, you know, the sponsorship dilemma from a side of the publisher. And so, like I said, we've done an amazing job of being able to, you know, generate revenue from that asset in perpetuity outside the context of the time horizon that it was traditionally delivered.
Yeah, and venues continue to be data collection zones, with the traditional venues where people are gathering, and hopefully we get to that point really soon. But, you know, collecting data by just doing your old school work with exit surveys and asking people questions, to more sophisticated approach of monitoring and collecting mobile traffic, and being able to correlate that to other things that people are doing or understand more about consumer behaviors based on how people are moving around and interacting with the brand. Those are the kinds of things that can also be used as partner extensions, things that, you know, first party data owned by a venue in a mobile capacity could be then handed over to partners and things like that too. So there are ways to do some basic sharing of some of that data in a completely privacy allowable world.
And if just to add to that, if you think about the fidelity of that data too, right? If somebody has now entered into the polygon that you've specified, and it's an event for in particular, right? You think about inherently how strong that signal is from a data standpoint versus maybe somebody who has tripped across a website at some point in time, right? You now have somebody who is actively in the environment. And I think and I think sponsors need to think about how they evaluate themselves based on that. There's a premium attached to that, right? There's a premium attached to that versus some of those other, you know, touch points that I talked about earlier.
Yeah, and I guess that, you know, the concept of premium comes into, you know, valuation conversations. Mm-hmm. Do you find that you've got you know, specific elements that you're publishing through Vertical Scope that are priced over and above what somebody would buy in programmatic?
Well, yeah, I mean, here's the thing, right? A lot of you know, what you offer programmatically is much more standard versus what you don't offer programmatically, which is non-standard. I also talked about what we do from a content standpoint. We do a lot of custom content, a lot of custom related programming, custom assets that we produce that are only available through a direct relationship, right? So, you know, that's how we operate the dynamic in our world.
So, you know, you kind of hear sometimes where people will come in as a brand and having a conversation with you know, a sponsored organization and say, well, why would I pay X to you when I can pay 1/10 of that and buy your audience in Facebook? So I think it becomes, how do you put that context to the conversation to show your value?
Well, you know, it's interesting, you know, a lot of the ways that, you know, brands come to us is they discover us through doing searches online, right? Google has to go somewhere, right? And so more often than not, they'll land on a community, whether they're recognized or they don't, they'll land on a community. Say, I made the Camaro analogy. We own a Camaro forum, right? If you do a search on how to replace or looking to replace my tires on my Camaro, 90% of the time you're going to those organic search results, which is authentic content from somebody who's actively looking to solve this problem. They're going to get exposed to something like that, right? And I think that's inherently a big part of our value proposition is in how advertisers actually sell themselves, because they recognize, they see that people are actively having conversation or they're actively participating in those communities. Beyond that, beyond that, once they recognize that there is in fact some kind of interest and inherent demand around their product or offering, they say, okay, well, now any good marketer is going to sit back and say, listen, well, how do I sprinkle a little gas on that fire? How do I actually accelerate that demand that's already there? And so that's usually the next conversation we have. As that marketer becomes much more sophisticated, they say, well, how do we maybe change up our assortment? How do we actually get more? How do we actually set up shop in your environment? How do we actually become a much more integrated partner? And most of the conversations that we're having today is really about those types of integrations, those sort of more 360 style solutions, where what you're doing is you are providing, not only providing content and display media, but you might even also be doing some affiliate related marketing as well. And the offering that we provide is our ability to really orchestrate those things, really use, lead and create a groundswell with the content that we create and distribute that through the communities, and then start to layer on paid media where it makes most sense. So that's my sales pitch for in terms of how marketers work with us.
So are there some
Dave? I have a question for you, Dave.
Sure.
I don't know if you touched on this, but is there greater value from the logged in to non-logged in users for you guys?
Oh, that's an interesting. We're having a lot of those discussions today, right? If you think about the way that communities work, right, you really have a fraction of the community that's actually producing the content relative to the amount of people that visit or are searching out for information, right? You think about people that are lurking versus those that are actually producing, posting information and sharing and that kind of thing. It's interesting because it depends. I think it largely depends on the use case. If you say, for example, I want to target people who are, Camaro owners, someone in the logged in state clearly is clearly an enthusiast and a fan, and has a recurring relationship with the website, the high likelihood that they're an owner, right? Versus a researcher may or may not. So there's inherently some value there. I think it's still early stage in sort of tapping that. I think where the real opportunity is that augmentation I talked about at the very beginning of this, which is to say, okay, now that how do I take that opportunity when somebody is registering to learn a little bit more about them than I didn't know about them the day before. And I think that's a slower process, and that takes a little bit more time. But ultimately, that's where we want to be heading, is down that path.
That's an interesting point, I think, for marketers to capture is if they do have consumers who log in or are part of a loyalty program or who are in an email database, is to asking those folks to come back and provide that, some additional levels of information about them, so that those points of data can be of more value versus just a name and an email address. There's some value to marketers focusing on building that out.
And I think what we're doing too is we're kind of retreading on territory with the absence. I mean, you can't really talk about the third-party cookie situation with really not talking about sort of the privacy aspect of all this as well, right? The environment we're heading into, and Brian alluded to, is that we're heading into a much more regulatory intense environment around these things. And so anything that you do needs to, of course, abide by these ethical and guidelines and privacy stipulations that are being laid out. And the governments have gotten wise. They've gotten wise to what's been happening around data collection. So now you need, as you go through these sort of discussions, you have these discussions, and you want to bolster what you have from a first-party data standpoint, you need to make sure that obviously that you're abiding by all these guidelines that are being stipulated now.
Yeah, and that's always a moving target, what those regulations are and where they're coming from. One of the conversations we had leading up to this about commingling data. And whether there's opportunities for a brand to work with a partnered organization and say, okay, we want to look at putting all of our cookies both into some sort of white room and finding ones that are similar in order to create those like audiences. I don't know, maybe you can give some description to what commingling would actually look like.
Sure. I mean,
it's actually. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go, Brian. Brian, you go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say it's actually something that's being outlined in the Canadian Digital Charter as far as privacy regulations go, in that the concept of a clean room is actually a legitimate way for first-party data holders to augment their existing data pools. So essentially what that does is imagine there's a room and the room is clean. There's nothing else in it. And both brands are putting in their data segments. The platform matches where there are similarities, eliminates everything else, and then passes back to each one of those brands a little bit more data about each one of those similar items, whether it's a device pool or whether it's a cookie pool, whatever that happens to be, so that each brand walks away with a little bit more knowledge about that. So this is something that is becoming a bit of a growing trend. I think it's been in the UK for a little while now. It's going to start making its way into North America as we start seeing these the impact of the cookie crumbling. So it's a unique way as well to for brand partnerships to build, and for brands to combine and work together as well, to who have like-minded interests, and being able to forge new ways to work together.
Yeah, and I think it's so. Just to add on to that, right? So if you think about where is this germinating from? It's germinating from Europe and the UK, where GDPR became such a became such a big thing, right? And constricted what people could do from a data standpoint. So being able to offer up an alternative method to create and augment people's existing data set, this is clearly one of the ways that you can do that. And so it's becoming much more, I think it's going to be more of a phenomenon here in the short order.
Yeah, because just think about, people think about their standard benefits that they provide a sponsor or a brand coming in. This data access actually seems like a whole new benefit to be providing, and could have some significant value to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was another thought I had when you were talking about earlier, and you mentioned Google's got to go somewhere. And I'm thinking about SEO and how people, tag their sites. Should people be looking at including tags about their audience within that? Is that going to make them rank differently in the SEO and be found by the audiences that brands want?
What you're saying maybe to add to that metadata within the page and have to better direct users. I think what Google is trying to do now, you're seeing what's happening around identity management and some of the new things that they're trying to roll out. This idea of cohorts and so forth is a way to, I think, address what you're talking about, which is to provide data taxonomies of like people in a way that is largely anonymous and doesn't target individuals specifically. So Google's actively, they have something called Flock, right, which is something that they've been part of their privacy sandbox and something that they've been working on. And that looks like that's going to be the standard going forward, or at least that's what the discussions are about right now.
Tell me I didn't. Excellent. Yeah, because I was thinking, I'm going to pick on Jen from Saskatchewan Science Center because I know she's on the call. But is there value for the Science Center to start saying, okay, we tag with families, tag with youth, science, those other elements that might be more defined in terms of their audience? I stumped the pair of you.
Oh, sorry. Was that directed at us?
Yeah. No, I was just kind of throwing it out there as metadata.
Well, here's the thing,
you want
right?
a Jen to answer.
Yeah, that's what I thought. But no, okay, so you think about what is SEO ultimately, right? You're trying to improve the relevancy of what's on the page, and what succeeds in relevancy has everything to do with what's being searched on. The reason that we succeed, why we're such a strong indexer, is because people are searching for very long tail type of keywords that can only be discovered in environments like ours that live on in perpetuity when someone looks for them, right? So, how much did you pay for a Pathfinder? Right? It's a search term that is going to rank well within a community because it's not ephemeral. It lives there. There's authentic people responding to that content, and Google rewards us for that reason. So in the case of if you are working for the Science Center, or you've got your ability to actually, I mean, it's just classic SEO, your ability to rank well against keywords that key search terms that people are looking for, and create content bespoke to that that is highly relevant, that has an element of authority to it, is absolutely an important strategy for sure.
And then, looking at some of the questions we got in advance, and if anybody's got any questions, jump in. I think one of the questions was, talking about cookies' ability to target and where that goes. So, can you actually target to one individual? And I think the answer is probably no. But how defined do those groups change from the current setup to finding those like-minded individuals in the future?
Yeah, you could never target one individual unless you were sending, say, one email to somebody. In advertising, from a programmatic perspective, was always thought of, large groups of individuals that we want to be able to reach and try to make sure we're finding the right ones within those groups. And that used to be based on, really good indicator of what that group was made up of. It's now just really about new ways to organize the groups, whether that group is based on, contextual behavior, like thinking about, I want to target automotive sites, or I want to target sites that have a certain kind of content that's relevant to my message, or thinking about things like geography or mobile devices that have more longevity and probably have more associated data to them, and thinking about geography as the indicator and where I want to be able to market. So the approach becomes is ultimately going to become more broad-based, but you still have new and unique ways that you can group individuals together to try and find at least there's some science involved in being able to understand the best tactics to move forward.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's interesting with third-party data, especially in the retargeting context, because it's actually you can retarget. You don't know who the individual is, but you're retargeting on the behavior. So in that way, that becomes, and this is why I think that a lot of legislatures have defined, certainly under the CCPA guidelines, which is the California Consumer Protection thing, is because they're saying that this is PII. Right? They're saying that this is personally identifiable information, and so it's largely in the retargeting context where that becomes kind of a thing.
And I know we were talking in prep for the conversation. We were talking about the different platforms that exist for buying advertising and identifying audiences. Definitely, there's a lot of players who are going to be affected by the loss of third-party data. But do you see Google's got its own platform, and you've got all the social media platforms where you can buy audiences in Facebook or Instagram, etc. Are they going to be impacted by this, or does the fact that they've got this information make that a bigger conduit for people to go to?
Well, you often hear people talk about the duopoly, right? The center of the universe kind of gravitates around those two entities. Certainly in the advertising world, the $400 billion that's spent in the advertising universe, a lot of it goes to those walled gardens. And look at Google has a stranglehold. They have 60% share in this of browser share with Chrome. This is why this discussion is such a big discussion. Interestingly, Google's business model is around advertising. They started their business around search, but they make their revenue through advertising, and they're deeply interconnected to this ecosystem. That's why they've been so slow to respond and create a solution that addresses a lot of this stuff. By contrast, you have like Apple, who made a declaration over a year ago and canceled third-party cookies because truthfully, they don't have a huge stake in the game. Right, and they use that as a USP. They turn the fact that they were going to eliminate third-party cookies as a fact that this is their sort of stance on privacy, right? And they use that in their advertising at that time as well. And if you remember, about a year ago, there was some advertising around this. But yeah, so So Google is being very careful, and it wouldn't be surprising if they also delay this or drag this thing out even further than they've claimed, right? Because they have very vested interest in this whole ecosystem.
Yeah, there's a rush for other technology providers to come up with unique identifiers or Identity 2.0 and some other platforms that are looking to basically come up with a new type of cookie-based system. And it's funny how the impact of Google can have on some of those companies when they just come out and say, man, we're not going to allow our Gmail address base to become part of that, and it has a huge impact on these new identifiers. Email was one of those things that was quickly identified as this is a common product. Email typically stays with somebody for a long time, so email could be part of that Identity 2.0. And Google is the largest holders of emails, and so they can really kind of impact everybody else's decisions. But the duopoly is quickly being joined by Amazon, and Amazon has seen significant growth in the last year just simply because of COVID and shopping behaviors and patterns and stuff like that. So all of that's logged in base data, and they're a major player in this space too now. So the three of them have a big impact.
Yeah, and thinking about the value of audiences for different organizations and the cost of specific keywords. So Google AdWords, some of the if you're looking for insurance or you're looking for financial, the cost of that AdWord can be quite expensive. So if you can offer a competitive reach to that audience, should you start looking at where your audience fits into those potential keywords and start promoting yourself out that way?
That's a good example, Brad. I think looking at understanding how expensive your search terms are relative to your whatever it is you're selling, whatever your entity is, and using that as a valuation or a proof point. If it's costing me on a cost per click basis, it's costing me $200, right? To contrast that to say somebody walking into a venue, right? A click on somebody who may have already been searching for that thing anyway, right? And you just pay $200 for that click versus somebody actually entering that venue. And if you can start to build your valuation around concepts like that, because oftentimes you'll get we'll see objections. I mean, we're a publisher and we're battling these behemoths, right? And so when we're addressing objections like, why should I spend money with you or whatever, being able to say, well, listen, by contrast, you can actually be involved in a conversation directly in the consumer decision journey, or you can be throwing money at a search term that somebody's always was going to link to anyway.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that could seriously reshape something like sampling. If the cost per click on a Google AdWord is X, and you're looking at how many people you're getting through a sampling site at an event, the equivalency would be saying that each person who sampled that would be the same as somebody clicking.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to look at that value and whether or not there's an undervaluation that's been happening.
Well, I think at the end of the day, an experience will trump a click, I think, at the end of the day. And I think you have to, if you're coming out, if I was in the sponsorship business, that's the way I would be approaching that problem. I would say you can't evaluate these things in the same fashion. The experience will trump this lesser signal for a much more high fidelity, super sensory experience.
Yeah, and we've talked about that a bit, here at Sponsor Circle. There's reach, but then there's reach with relevance, and we find that sponsorship brings that relevance as opposed to just being, a somewhat stagnant ad in somebody's feed. So we had a question just, looking at the tracking of data and cookies. Have you guys heard anything about the potentially first-party cookies going? their first-party data disappearing?
I think that Dave would probably agree that first-party data will not go away. People are gonna, brands, products, whatever they're gonna own their own data product to some degree. Maybe there'll be some adjustments or changes in how it can be used, but it's not going to go away. There's too many things that offer convenience factors for consumers that brands are just not going to want to have depreciate. I think company's been collecting their own first-party data since the first time somebody asked a question about, what do you think of this? And so first-party data has always existed in some form or another, and it's not going to go away.
Yeah, I'd echo that.
And then, one of the other questions, and this is a great opportunity for maybe for you, Brian, to talk about what you do at Connected Interactive. But what are effective strategies brands should be looking at when it comes to investing their dollars now?
What are some strategies? Well, certainly spending all your programmatic dollars with Connected Interactive is the safest thing to do. So many different types of strategies, so many different types of brands. It's a pretty tough one to answer, but I think it's really just kind of, going and reevaluating KPIs. What is something that we really want to do that we can now measure in the new world? And if you haven't started thinking about that, then you should definitely be doing it now. You could start making adjustments on what it is you want to be able to measure. There are a lot of performance brands out there, performance marketers, who must be very concerned about what's coming up, but they need to rethink about how they're assigning attribution. A lot of brands rely on Google Analytics, for example. It's a free tool off the shelf, has a number of inherent issues with it to begin with, but it always only tells that brand or that publisher or whoever that what happened on the last click. And the last click aspect of this is going to be nothing you could use anymore. You're not going to be able to activate on that. So the attribution funnel needs to be rethought through. Is the performance indicator going to be, someone searched an ad and then clicked on and made a purchase, or is it going to be how many different channels am I utilizing right now that are actively impacting the amount of traffic that's going through into my site? And that's kind of the biggest thing I can think of. That's one of the impacts we're seeing a lot right now is there's too much reliance on Google Analytics as the tool, and they should be thinking broader.
And do you guys have recommendations for how organizations should be positioning themselves and things that they can do that are going to benefit them as advertisers are having to pivot and change?
Well, the media mix, the different things within the full activation channel should start being analyzed. So we work with a lot of major brand advertisers that are running TV and outdoor radio, other media, and digital has always been this tool that you could measure in isolation of that, and it shouldn't be done anymore. It should be just part of the mix. The modeling should take a look at at a bigger scale in terms of all of these things that are being done that can impact what the final KPI is. I'm seeing there's a person on the channel here, someone we're working with, a company called called Custometrics, and David Beaton. Glad you could make it out. But they're doing interesting work on what the mixed media modeling looks like and how that impacts ultimately sales at the end. And digital in those cases isn't treated as an isolated product, which digital marketers have always just thought digital channel. It needs to be thought of now as part of the mix, and all these elements of the mix can play a role in how those sales are being driven, and that should be analyzed.
And David, any thought from your end, recommendations that because you're kind of living in that content world, things like sort of best practices you've seen work for you that could be carried over?
Oh, geez, best practices. I mean, based on what we were talking about today, I was giving this a little bit of thought, right? what's going to happen in the absence of cookies. And what I'm hoping is going to happen is that there's going to be, at least from marketers and advertisers, a little effort and thought into pre-planning, right? A little more effort and thought in pre-planning and understanding, getting a little bit more strategic in advance. I think for a long time, what we've been doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to we're going to I'll use agencies as an example. We're going to allocate so much to these different channels, and we're just going to throw a bunch of money into this programmatic channel and to sort of set and forget. And I think and let results dictate what we do. But I think now in a world where you have in the absence of cookies, what's going to happen is, or what I'm hoping is, that we're going to see a little more of a trend towards doing a little more upfront planning, really leaning into strategic partnerships that really challenge the publisher to bring all the best they can bring to bear. And I know, like, most of the conversations we have now with and a lot of the direct relationships we have now are exactly on that level, right? They're much more evolved, and I think we're just going to hopefully see a little bit more of that. As far as the best practice is concerned, I think what you do is you challenge your partners. Some of the best conversations, and I can think about a conversation we had back a couple of weeks ago with the client. Client came to us and said, "Listen, I don't care what you're telling me over here about all this, the what you can produce from an analytics standpoint. I don't care about all this other stuff. What I want from you is I want to understand how best to utilize your platform. What is the best way to do it? I don't want a cookie cutter solution." And we were, given the opportunity to do that, we jumped into that both feet. We said, "Great. That's what we love to do. That's what we love to do. Love to work with our partners in that kind of a way." And so that's turning out to be a pretty solid relationship that we're forming. So yeah, I mean, I think it's challenge your partners, get those conversations going, operate collaboratively. As a publisher, be willing to go that extra mile. These are the things that the Facebooks and the Googles of the world will not do. Unless you are spending millions upon millions of dollars, they will not assign an account manager to you. You'll be lucky to get it. So, there are operators like us who are in the wings, who are ready and willing to put our best brains, our best ability, and our best understanding of how we operate as a business forward.
Dave worked in Cookie Cutter. He worked Cookie Cutter into the conversation, so we should probably just leave it right there.
Oh, geez. Did I do that? That was unintentional. That was completely unintentional.
But it definitely sounds like, content is going to be such a big, huge driver moving forward. So I think, bringing that relevance and that context to what you deliver is going to provide that value for brands. Certainly, I found the whole, cookie and programmatic discussion always to be a little nebulous, and kind of, it's a big gray area. So really appreciate you guys bringing some context to it. I'm going to speak on behalf of Brian and David, but I'll include their emails in a follow-up to today's session if you want to reach out and have any additional conversations about what they're doing and how they're operating. Really thank you guys for coming. Our next session's with Adam Mitchell from IMI's Sponsor Pulse on June 16th. So we'll send some information out shortly about registering for that. And Brian, David, thanks so much for your time today. Great kind of getting some insight on this.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
All right. Bye, guys.
Take care.
Bye-bye.